So some recent headlines have suggested that eating plant-based oils is better than eating butter, better for you than eating butter. So is this evidence-based? What maybe is really going on here, and what are some key takeaways? So in this video, I'm going to share 2 key problems with the study in question, the 2 or 3 main problems with epidemiological research in general, which is the type of research that this is, also known as observational research. One way in which this reminds me of trans fat and the story of trans fat, and then a few other key takeaways as well. So what are the 2 key problems with this study? So the study in question, which I hesitate to call a study because it's epidemiological research or observational research, which, by the way, is the type that only can show correlation, can't show causation as a general rule. So that's one key thing to be aware of. But the 2 key problems are they're talking about butter and they're talking about plant oils, but they don't know how much butter these people ate. So credit to Vinay Prasad here. He's a professor of biostatistics, among other things, and I watched a video that he made, and he pointed out they don't know how much butter the people were eating. So first of all, when you do these kind of studies, it's based on questionnaires, and so people have to fill out questionnaires about what they're eating. So, what did you eat last week? What did you eat a month ago, or whatever? So, of course, you're probably not going to remember what you ate a week ago, and so it's not going to be accurate. But more importantly, they did some sort of fuzzy estimate based on the results of the questionnaires to kind of come up with a rough idea about how much butter the people were eating. And they divided them into these groups that were probably kind of inaccurate and stuff. So I'm not a professor of biostatistics, so I don't know the details as well as Vinay Prasad did, but he explained it pretty well. So that's one big problem, obviously, if you don't know how much butter they were eating. But beyond that, they also made one other kind of ridiculous thing, and that is they lumped all of the oils together. So the extra virgin olive oil was lumped together with the soybean oil and the canola oil. And we know there's a big difference. Olive oil has been around for a long time, whereas soybean oil and canola oil are these new inventions within the last 100 years, these new things that humans haven't been eating before, and now we're eating a ton of it. So there's a huge difference. So those are a couple problems with this study, and just piggybacking on that for a second, remember this is epidemiological research, also known as observational research, which can only show correlations, not causations. But the 2 big problems with it in general when they do this kind of nutrition observational research, is they're basing it on questionnaires, which are going to be inaccurate, as I alluded to. And also, here's the other big thing. When you have all these statistics about what people ate in the past and stuff like that, based on questionnaires and so forth, if you start running these different statistical analyses, apparently you can come up with basically any conclusion you want. One way you can see that in real life is all these different headlines about coffee is great for you, coffee is terrible for you, eggs are great for you, eggs are going to save you, green tea is great for you, green tea is terrible for you, chocolate, and all these other things. There's certain ones, blueberries, those are the ones that they really like to put in the headlines. And they'll have these headlines about how they're really good for you and sometimes how they're really bad for you. And the headlines can't both be true, obviously, right? So that happens all the time, and that's because when they have all these statistics about how much chocolate people eat or whatever, they'll run these different statistical analyses, and then certain ones will jump out because it's like, oh, look, it looks like it's really good, or oh, look, it looks like it's really bad. They ignore all the ones in the middle. They don't want the headline to say, chocolate is neutral, because that would be really boring, obviously. So that's why you see all these conflicting headlines. And this is another example of that, because they can run this statistical analysis basically any way they want. And they can come up with 1,000 different conclusions or 1,000 different kind of results just by making little adjustments with the statistics, because there are a lot of adjustments and things that they do when they run these kind of statistics. So that's the other big problem with the nutritional epidemiological research, and that's why you see all these crazy headlines, and this is yet another example of that. So one really interesting thing about this, it reminded me of a book that I was reading recently called Anti-Fragile. And in the book Anti-Fragile, he talks about things that stand the test of time. And so if something's been around a while, it's much more likely to be something that's going to stand the test of time versus something that's very new. So guess what's very new? Soybean oil and canola oil. But that's not my point yet. My point was he was talking about trans fats. So he said trans fat, for a couple of decades there, like the 70s and 80s or give or take, they were telling us, oh, eat this margarine that's full of trans fat. That's going to be better for you because it has less saturated fat. Does that sound familiar? That's the same reason they tell us to eat these plant oils, these other plant oils or whatever, the soybean oil and the canola oil, and to avoid the butter, as they say it's because of this difference in saturated fat. Well, in the case of trans fat, obviously they eventually realized that was way worse than anything else, and you really should not be eating the stuff with the trans fat, like the margarine at the time that was full of trans fat. So now, comparing that to these seed oils, they are new, they are lower in saturated fat. But saturated fat has basically been exonerated. There's no longer a need to cap how much saturated fat you eat or really be worried about it as a general rule. And then these seed oils have not stood the test of time, getting back to the anti-fragile idea, because they're all new. They were basically invented in the last 100 years because they needed this industrial process to be able to get the oil out of the soybeans and whatever kind of seed the canola is and all these different things. And they have to use solvents like hexane and all these deodorants, and then they heat them at a very high heat and cause a bunch of oxidation. So there are harmful effects that have been shown from the oxidized oils and things that are in these plant oils, these seed oils, these so-called vegetable oils, various downstream effects. So are they good for you? I would say probably not the ones that we're talking about. They're these new inventions, this new huge human experiment that's going on that we don't know all the results of. But the linoleic acid in them seems to build up in our fat cells and cause some untoward effects and so forth that have been described by various researchers, including Ben Bickman, who was on my podcast and talked about that. Butter's been around a lot longer, so it's doing a much better job of standing the test of time than I suspect these other oils will do. So when in doubt, the burden of proof should be on something new, some new intervention. If there's a new intervention that hasn't yet stood the test of time, then the burden of proof should be on someone to show us that that thing is better. And so what's the new intervention? Seed oils. Seed oils haven't been around very long. The early results aren't great. The jury's kind of still out because more research needs to be done. But the burden of proof should be to show that they're actually better for us, which has not been done. Certainly not by this study. And what's really going on with this study, of course, it's kind of politically motivated because of the timing, and they want to have all these headlines that kind of go against what RFK Jr. is saying, against some of his statements about seed oils. So that seems to be, so it's basically political propaganda, but it also suffers from those issues that epidemiological research tends to suffer from. And it's, promoting stuff that has not stood the test of time and probably will not stand the test of time. So it's really hard to avoid these types of oils because they're ubiquitous in the food supply. They're in, if you get salad dressing or something, it's going to have soybean oil or canola oil or what have you. And so it's really hard to avoid them. They're in a bunch of other processed foods, but it's worth considering that they're probably not good for us. And you shouldn't lump the soybean oil and the safflower oil and the canola oil with olive oil because they're just different categories essentially. But it's worth considering that, even though it's really hard to avoid them, it might be better, and so something to think about. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Fasting Well.